I'm going to speak today about war as well. Of course, war is always very costly for those who are fighting and for civilians as well. And this is statistics of wars in the 20th century and the estimated number of people that have lost their lives. It's sometimes difficult for people to calculate these things, so you may find other statistics in other history books. But if you're trying to do the mathematics, this is a very large number that have died in the 20th century. And of course, that takes no account of people who have died as a result of the knock-on effects of war, poverty and contamination and things like that. So, war is costly. We think more about this perhaps than we think about the effect of war on the land, on the landscape in which the war is carried out. Although this also has ongoing and very severe consequences for both human beings and for nature. You may know that this year has been the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I in Europe, and I know this didn't have a major impact in Argentina, but in Europe certainly our thoughts have been turned to this war that took so many lives and was in many ways so futile. And I've been studying this a little bit over the last few weeks. So what are the effects that war has on the earth? Well, it has short-term effects on things like bomb or shell damage, actually landing on parts of the natural landscape. It can have damage to do with policies that governments enact, like scorched earth, burning the earth to hinder the enemy. And of course, chemical spraying was a feature in the First World War, and we've already heard about the problems of chemical warfare and the attempts to stop them being used. And then on the bigger scale, war can leave long-term soil and water pollution, deforestation, either to clear ground for sight lines or to use the timber, can be a problem, and unexploded munitions, weapons that have been left undischarged, can also cause a big threat. And we think maybe here of also landmines in quite recent conflicts. I want to talk a little bit more about the effect of warfare on the land in the First World War. The Northern Front, which stretched along the whole of the boundary roughly between France and Belgium, right from the English Channel through to the Swiss Alps. And here there was approximately 100 hectares of forest that was severely damaged or cut down. And the Germans and the English, both sides, were engaged in massive deforestation. The Battle of Verdun, which was a 10-month-long battle in 1916 around the town of Verdun, 300,000 men died and approximately 60 million shells were fired. That's a huge amount on a very small part of the French countryside. And more significantly for the future would be the fact that approximately 1 in 5 rounds of ammunition failed to detonate, so were left potentially active in the soil. I've got 2 PowerPoints going here. This is actually a map of the Northern Front, and right on the left-hand side there, that is the English Channel, and right down in the bottom corner is where the Swiss Alps begin. So it's going along the boundary between France and Belgium and France and Germany. So the task of rebuilding after war is huge. And this is a quote from a historian or a military historian. The war had transformed swathes of northern and eastern France into denuded, cratered environments. French society faced the daunting prospect of trying to find meaning in environments of slaughter while demilitarizing and reconstructing the war-torn countryside. So the effects of war don't stop once the war has ended. They continue to this day. And the effects of the First World War are many. There was soil erosion, and the soil erosion that took place in the 4 years of the war was the equivalent of what would naturally occur over a period of between 10,000 and 40,000 years. So it was a massively accelerated transformation of the landscape. I said that many trees were cut down, and what happened was that in some places there was replanting, but it was, instead of ancient oak and beech woodland, it was monoculture. It was quick-growing trees, pines, and so on, that actually don't create a rich habitat for other species, but are a monoculture. And the number of unexploded munitions that I referred to has resulted in the fact that today still 16 million acres of French countryside are cordoned off. Nobody is allowed to go there. They're called the red zone, zona roja, because they are too dangerous for people. That's a lot of the French countryside you would not be able to travel in if you were in northern France. To this day, there are bomb disposal experts working continuously to try and clear unexploded bombs and shells and to make the countryside safe again. And only a few years ago, one of the bomb disposal experts was killed while trying to move an unexploded bomb. So it's an ongoing story, 100 years later, that's still being played out. And of course, the unexploded munitions have in them heavy metals that are very toxic to wildlife and to humans: arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, phosphorus, and so on. And this is posing still a threat. Now, not just statistics, but poetry is a very big part of World War I. I suspect in every war there are poets, but particularly in this time when there was no mass communication, there was no outlet for pain and anguish, many soldiers fighting took to pen and paper and wrote very evocative poetry. And I want to look at this other perspective of poetry and war. And this is what two quotes on the importance of poetry to help us to understand and get behind what is really going on in the war. And I'll leave you to read those rather than trying to read them in English and then in Spanish. Some of the poems are very triumphalistic, nationalistic, victorious. I've spent a lot of time over the last few months reading them, and they're determined that England is going to win, and they're quite a sort of testimony to the what we call the stiff upper lip, which is the traditional British kind of determination to not let things get on the top of us. But many of the others are very melancholy. They're really wrestling with the problem of being in the midst of what seems like a futile war. And some of them are very bitter, very angry that either they or their loved ones, their relatives, have been sent into a futile conflict. Most of the poems deal with the armies, the soldiers, the trenches where they carried out war, the paraphernalia of war, but some do include poignant descriptions of the effect of the war on the earth. And I've got here a couple of quotations. I hope you can see the red against the purple there. But this is a very little-known war poet. I'd never heard of him until I read that. But he says, "The trees all bent and battered, seared with scars where shrapnel spattered, bow like aged men beneath a heavy load." So the trees are damaged irretrievably by the battle. And then, better known, Siegfried Sassoon. This is describing the march of the troops as they're going from safety and the grass-green land to the land where all is ruin and nothing blossoms but the sky that hastens over them where they endure, sad, smoking, flat horizons, reeking woods. Very evocative. Now, the First World War poets were not the first, by a long way, to raise awareness of the costly nature of war and its effect on the land. Yeah, we can't do it now. It's too late now, I think. So I want to talk for the next 10 minutes or so about some examples from the prophetic texts of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And just to give you an example, this is a very graphic description from the book of Habakkuk of an army marching forward, the Babylonian army coming across the hillside, and Habakkuk has captured it in vivid poetry, captured the fearsomeness and the terror that he is experiencing. I think that some of the poets in the Hebrew Bible the poems have extreme resonance with what is expressed in the poetry of the First World War soldiers, and they portray an acute awareness of the damage inflicted on landscapes, on the land in times of war. Now, they also differ from the modern texts, the modern poems, in that the justification that they offer for the reason why the war is happening is very much theocentric, centered around God and what God is doing. I've only got time today to touch on a few points of overlap between the ancient texts and the modern ones, but these areas of overlap include things like the physical effects of warfare on the land and on the non-human inhabitants, the reaction of the earth and the way it's often described in terms of emotion, and the way that the descriptions of the earth are often expanded to include apocalyptic language in both ancient poetry and in the modern. So I want to start with Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, and the context of this book, this prophetic book, is the invasion and the defeat of Judah by the Babylonians in the late 6th century BCE. Jeremiah is a prophet, he's also a poet, and at one and the same time he's trying to warn the people that they need to change, and at the same time to understand and to explain why this is happening, and in a way to vindicate God's act of judgment against them. So we see here a graphic lament at the advancing army. He is in anguish. His soul is deeply troubled. He says, disaster overtakes disaster. The whole land is destroyed. The whole land is laid waste. He's feeling it in a very deep and intense way. And then he goes on to say, in a series of very graphic descriptions, describing the aftermath of the battle. Notice several things as we go through the text. First of all, the sense that the whole cosmos, the whole of the universe is disturbed, has been disrupted. The earth was waste and void, and the heavens had no light. That expression, waste and void, in Hebrew, asolada y vacía, in the Hebrew, that is the word that is used at the beginning of Genesis, tohu vabohu, to describe the formless beginning of God creating. The earth was formless and void, bohu vatohu. And here in Jeremiah, it's almost as if he's describing the unmaking of creation by using that expression, and then saying there is no light. Well, at the beginning of Genesis, that was the first act of creation. So it's almost like he's likening what he sees to being the creation being unmade, being undone, being unraveled. And then he says he sees the mountains and that they are trembling. The physical earth is somehow involved in this. This is poetry. We shouldn't look for literal explanations, but the physical earth is disturbed. And that kind of language is often associated in the Hebrew scripture with theophany, with the picture of God coming. But here it's to do with the warfare that they are experiencing. And then we see that depopulation has taken place. There are no people, and often that is a practical result of war. But here it's not just people that are fleeing the war, but the birds and other species. Everything is going away, and first the species, and then the towns are emptied. And the land goes from being el campo fértil to being barren, from being fertile to barren. And that's the effect of war also, that it takes something that is flourishing and lush and makes it into a wasteland. And this is the final judgment that Jeremiah pronounces. This is an act of God, he is saying. And I want you to notice the language, I hope this translated here, of the earth mourning. Did that translate? Yes, the earth mourning. This is very graphic language that is used often in the prophets, about 9 or 10 times, to describe the effect of the earth on the earth of people's sin, of human actions, their sinfulness, their forgetting of God, or sometimes of God's judgment itself. And here, the earth is mourning. So it's not just the prophet that's lamenting, but it's also the earth lamenting as well. I've got another example here, which I'll just look at quickly. Here again, the army that comes from Dan is coming to destroy not just the earth, but everything that is in it. Everything that is in it. So again, that's a sort of cosmic picture, a global picture, that warfare is not just something that affects human populations. And again, following on in Jeremiah 9, this is a lament for the pastures and the mountains. In the book of Lamentations, traditionally associated in authorship to Jeremiah as well, it is one long lament against the effect of Babylonian invasion and exile on the people. Here Jeremiah is lamenting the natural world. It's a powerful picture. I want to return now to the war prophets and hope that you will be able to see some echoes in their language of what we've already seen in the prophets or at least in the prophet Jeremiah. Notice that the earth is personified. As it had a voice in Jeremiah, so it has a voice here. La tierra paciente. It's waiting, it's struggling with the effect of war. Notice too the reference to the cosmos, the stars, the whole of the universe is involved somehow for these poets. It's not something that is just happening to them physically. And then in the quote by Digby Hasler, the sun beats down and the earth is brown and dry. The earth is a wasteland. The earth is dried up. And I should have said that actually in Hebrew the word used to mourn, as in the earth mourning, can also mean to be dried up. So it's a bit of a word play there. And here we see the same thing, that the earth is dried up. And I would say perhaps we can read it as the earth mourning, because it has lost its lusciousness, its vegetation, its green. And then also notice that the fourth quote is really, really apocalyptic. It's really talking about the earth's foundations falling. It's almost talking about the end of the world, and yet this is just in the context of a battle. So these are very vivid and evocative images, and it's very interesting to me that these 20th century writers have picked up some of the language and the feeling, the emotion of people like Jeremiah when they're trying to describe warfare. It is like hell on earth, as we say, and it's something that profoundly affects them. And just in finishing, I want to make a couple of comments and then leave us on a slightly more positive note. I think that the fact that Jeremiah goes very quickly to lament over the effect of war is a very poignant, for me, clue as to perhaps how we should feel about war and the effect that it has, not just on people but on the land, that it is a matter for deep sorrow when landscapes are torn up and destroyed. It is a matter for deep sorrow when we read about situations in the world where there is warfare going on, that we need to be perhaps people that lament. I think that it's a reminder that we are an ecosystem. We are ecologically all held together, and that when one part of that is disrupted by warfare or any other means, then there is a knock-on effect. So 100 years ago, a small part of northern France was disrupted by a pretty futile and costly and damaging war, and yet still the wildlife in that area is not safe to go back, and the effect has gone on. So it's something that we struggle with, but we need to be aware of. And the third thing I'd like to throw out almost is which is always the perennial problem of how we read the ancient texts that speak so much of God as acting in the world today. How do we read those in our contemporary contexts? So that Jeremiah sees the Babylonian war as God's judgment on Judah. And of course we hold more lightly to that direct connection between something bad happening like a war and God's judgment. But it's something particularly theologically, if we are theological, we need to perhaps think out a little bit. And what the effect of, if we still think, as I do, that in some way God brings judgment, what effect that judgment has when it's a judgment against people for what they have done to the earth, which is something that we haven't had time to really go into. Okay, I've gone over a little bit. I just want to leave you with a couple more things. And that's to say, this is a pretty bleak picture, but is there any hope in Jeremiah or in the other prophets of the Hebrew Bible? And, first of all, say was hope in the First World War, not so much in modern warfare, but in earlier warfare, where there was no fighting, often nature would flourish. So in the no man's land between Germany and German line and the French line, it was a place where humans weren't destroying nature. So in the good times, nature could flourish. Not always the case, but it's possibility. And also, very interestingly, in my research about the poets of the First World War, many of the people, the soldiers in the trenches, learnt to appreciate nature because it wasn't doing what humans were doing. Humans were fighting, throwing bombs at one another. When we come to the Hebrew scriptures and the biblical prophets, interestingly, several places where, particularly in Isaiah, where when the people leave a city, it becomes inhabited by wildlife, by nature. And of course that is what will happen if a place is ruined, then vegetation will grow up and eventually species will take up residence there. And that's exactly what happens in Isaiah 13 and 34. And I think that's quite a good prophetic image of reminding us that we are not the only species on this planet, that actually other species will take over if we're gone. And in fact, that we need to perhaps have a little humility towards them. And then in Isaiah 35 and also in Jeremiah, the restoration of nature is seen as a sign of hope that all will not continue in such a bad way. It's looking forward to something better. And then just to leave you with a quote from one of the war poets, and actually notice this is a woman. You may not think that women would have been at the front line. Well, they were one step behind the front line, but there were many women that went to be nurses in the field hospitals of the First World War. And this is a woman recording that spring will come again. And that's the message of hope that she leaves in the midst of the warfare that she's surrounded by. Thank you very much.